Welcome. In Baltimore, the National Guard has departed, the curfew has been lifted, and 6 police officers are charged in connection with the death of 25-year-old Freddie Gray. After weeks of peaceful protests and some fiery riots, too, you hear it said that things are back to normal. But what's considered normal in some neighborhoods is very much the problem. So we will delve into that and compare today's protests to what triggered similar protests and uprisings in the 1960s. Also on the broadcast, progressive talk is in this political season. Locally and nationally, Bernie Sanders has joined the presidential race, and Hillary Clinton is trying to be taken seriously on inequality. Is the left on the rise? We will ask Dan Cantor, founder of the Working Families Party. Then, did you know that big data is now central to big agriculture? It brings efficiency, yes, but digital farming causes some furrowed brows as well. And toward the end of the hour, in our public intellectual segment, a study of who likes long work hours here and abroad. The cultural and gender differences are astounding. First, though, urban unrest. After inner cities began erupting in the late 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson convened the Kerner Commission to look into the root causes of the unrest in African-American neighborhoods. Led by Governor Otto Kerner of Illinois, it concluded that our nation was moving toward 2 societies, one black, one white, separate, unequal. To what extent has that prediction come true? Do we need a new Kerner-like commission, or should we just read that old report again, which became an instant bestseller back in 1968? Joining us, James Meyerson, a civil rights attorney and former lawyer for the New York NAACP. He's been involved in racial justice issues then and still is today. Also with us, R. Lewis-McCoy, Associate Professor of Sociology and Black Studies at City College. He's author of Inequality in the Promised Land, Race, Resources, and Suburban Schooling. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
You've called for a new Kerner Commission. Why that?
Because everything changes and nothing changes, and actually things have changed for the negative in terms of institutional and systemic racism and poverty in this country. It's interesting, 30 years after the Kerner Commission, Fred Harris, who was a senator from Oklahoma and on the original commission along with Roy Wilkins, Edward Brooke, a number of other people, he did a report which indicated things had not changed. They had not moved forward. They had not stayed the same. They had gotten worse. And I think that if you look at where we are today in urban America, civil disorder is triggered ordinarily, as the commission had said, by interactions between police and members of the minority communities in these urban settings. But they made the very important point that the context of all of that is deplorable housing, deplorable schools, high unemployment, lack of health care, lack of retail establishments that were otherwise available in all of these respects positively in white communities.
And that obviously sounds like today in so many respects, and we'll explore that in a minute, but just that language, that central prediction of the Kerner Commission that lasts to this day is one of the prime pull quotes, that our society could become a black and a white society, separate but unequal. Well, our country always was that from the beginning, and that was the 1960s. It was 5 minutes after Jim Crow.
Correct.
So how could they have been predicting it as a risk for the future? What was the historical context of that as you understand it?
Right. I think the historical context of the Kerner Commission is that it's really a temperature check of race relations and the urban condition. And what they revealed from a bipartisan and multiracial coalition is that things weren't well. But if we look at the history of the United States, we know that we've had separate and unequal societies. It was coming on the heels of some legislation that had been passed around the Civil Rights Act. And it was coming behind a lot of people saying, there's already been legal progress. Why is it seems that African Americans are discontented? The reality is that even when you have some legal action, many of the everyday lived conditions had not shifted. So when the Kerner Commission finds that we're moving towards something separate and equal, it oddly echoes Kerner Myrdal in American Dilemma, in which he found things were separate and unequal, which echoes Dred Scott, which goes on and echoing back into history. The reality is that sometimes we look for progress before it's occurred, and assume that we're living in a world that we're not.
And is it also because the Kerner Commission was responding to riots, particularly in northern cities, that's different from the Jim Crow South? That's the northern cities which held themselves superior in race relations, but maybe weren't all that superior?
Well, that's right. I'm always reminded of what Malcolm X said, which was everything south of Canada was South. And
was the South.
That's correct. And one of the things that the Kerner Commission articulated was that there was a perception within these segregated communities of the North that the police were an occupying force. And that perception still maintains. And in fact, a recent federal judge in the city of New York concluded it wasn't a perception, it was a reality, that there were massive stops, detentions, and arrests of African Americans, largely males, in the city of New York as if an occupying force. And so things haven't gotten better. They've really just entrenched more. And unless there is a commitment to address the issues of poverty and the interfacing of poverty with race in America, we're bound to maintain these civil disorders going forward. And I think it's important that the commission was a commission on civil disorder. It wasn't a commission on riots. Riots have a very kind of subtextual badness to them.
You mean the word?
The word. A civil disorder connotes that there's disorder among some elements of the civic society that aren't just for fun and joy, but because of serious conditions that are causing people not to buy into the system, but to drop out of the system. It is what Ngozi Adichie, the Nigerian author, has written about the oppressive lethargy of choicelessness. The
oppressive lethargy of choice. Do you want to talk about that too?
Yeah, I think in reality what we're talking about is a sustained condition of limited options in a land of plenty. So whether you're in East New York, right, whether you're in the Pink Houses, whether you're in Ferguson, which is actually a suburb of St. Louis. So as we talk about, things haven't changed. In fact, we have seen a suburbanization of poverty, right? And we have to be attentive to the differences in the landscape. Whether you're in Baltimore, Maryland, many of the people who wish and desire options, they haven't received opportunity. Instead, what we've given them is more and more of a prescription of pulling on their bootstraps, less and less of an investment to make sure that those areas that had been divested and received higher quality education, greater resources towards employment. We are being told that these areas are out of order, but these areas have been raising their voices, and I prefer the term civil unrest, right, or uprisings, because often what we're looking at is people expressing their voice and saying, we've been silenced for so long. When we marched peacefully, none of the cameras showed up. But all of a sudden, when CVS goes on fire, mainstream media jumps into the fray and says, what's going on?
Right. But can we say that what happened in Baltimore was a combination of an uprising by some people who were just genuinely angry and expressing themselves the way you just described, some thugs or gang members or criminals who were taking advantage of a situation, maybe some outside anarchists, political agitators who wanted to see this kind of thing happen for whatever ideological reasons, and that we need to pick those apart?
I think you could make that analysis, but I think particularly in Baltimore, what you're looking at are a set of young people in Baltimore who are aware of conditions, who have only lived a short lifespan, but know what oppression and occupation look like. So when we're talking about the mall scenario that expands out, we're not talking about some of the more organized protests where anarchists are very visible, where outside agitation is part of it. I think what you actually saw was organically young people responding to the threat of police presence. You saw 3 schools be dismissed simultaneously, and what happens is that folks responded. Now, subsequently, of course, there are questions of who comes in and what they do, but I think there was something much more organic happening there. I think there's a tendency within our analysis to try to separate those out who are legitimately protesting and those who are just ideological. And I get that, but on the ground, I'm not sure that's what played out initially in Baltimore when the nation started taking notice.
In historical context, I was surprised to see riots like that in Baltimore because there were riots like that in Baltimore in the 1960s. And I think that cities that experienced it at that time or since have tended not to go through it again. I wasn't that surprised to see it in Ferguson, which had never gone through it, but the cities that have gone through it have had, I think, historical memory that says we don't really accomplish anything by destroying our own neighborhoods. And so New York, Newark, Detroit, these cities have protested in other ways since the 1960s. Any reaction to that?
Well, the point that I've been trying to make in terms of using the term civil disorder rather than riot is that the order that is attached by the white society is different than the order that is in the segregated urban communities that exist. And so it's the disorder at some fundamental level is an order. It's an ordered pushback against what doesn't exist in those communities. So I don't view that as rioting. Rioting, again, to me connotes crazy people out there doing silly stuff for a myriad of reasons, rather than reacting to the oppression that the order in which they exist has inflicted on them.
Yeah, but maybe it would have been different if the violence was directed at City Hall or at police officers. To some degree it was. But when it's directed at the stores in the neighborhoods that are the victim neighborhoods, if you want to call it that, of the underlying disorder, then somebody didn't remember something from the past or didn't learn it, no?
You know, I think I have to push back against that for a particular reason. If you ask the police officers in Baltimore where the majority of interaction was, it was against them. It was against symbols of the state, right? We saw people marching downtown the day before and breaking windows. It was it was the personification of those frustrations. The CVS becomes the example, but there was very little actual property damage done comparatively. So I think folks were pushing in that direction. The other thing I want to push back against is that when we say rioting doesn't deliver what we desire, we wouldn't have the Civil Rights Act of 1968 had it not been for the uprisings that occurred following, right? So the Kerner Commission itself was largely ignored, but the needle continued to move as urban unrest continued to swell.
See, Brian, if I might say, you know, in raw numbers, there are more white people living in poverty than there are African American people, although disproportionate to their numbers, there is a great deal of poverty in African American communities. But what has occurred in America is an identification of poverty with African Americans because of the racial aspects to the discussion. Conscious, subconscious, soft racism, hard racism. Those two things interface. That's why there's so much pushback against Barack Obama, among other things, because he is identified as a president, unlike many of his predecessors who were from the South, with urban African American.
But at the same time, there is a statistical concentration of poverty among African Americans. It's much larger than among whites, and this is an African American social justice narrative, right? We have to do something about poverty being so concentrated, being such at higher rates in our communities, you know, as a result of hundreds of years of history.
Absolutely. It's not simply an issue of force, but it's how force is used disproportionately. And so that can be the conflict with police, but that can also be the ways in which schools have been failing, the ways in which intergenerationally employment has not been available in these areas. And as we start to think about, and I think it's important that we get to a place of where we're pushing on legislation about police and civilian interaction, but we also have to push on legislation that deals with urban change, and not simply that makes cities livable for those who are middle class or gentrifying, but those who are born and raised in them. So when we look at cities like Detroit, which have experienced a tremendous amount of outmigration, now the Detroit that's reemerging is really accessible to whom? So we have to make sure that these cities, which have been built and sustained by working class folks, still have a place for them.
And we're almost out of time, but that's the harder discussion to have, right? Because everybody's focusing now, as you indicate, on the criminal justice issues. Should police wear body cameras? Will these 6 go on trial, et cetera, et cetera? And that doesn't address the underlying social conditions that you've both been describing this whole segment.
Absolutely. And I think it's not either or. I think the best activists on the ground know it's and both. Let's deal with police violence and poverty and underfunded schools. And when we put those things together, we have a true social justice and change agenda. Until then, we're really just doing piecemeal work.
Yeah, that's correct. Police community encounters which trigger the civil disorders are an important but only a part of the total equation, and the greater part of the total equation are these underlying conditions and institutional and systemic structures.
Well, such an important conversation, and I think different from a lot of the ones we've been hearing. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor de Blasio is still holding off on endorsing Hillary Clinton until he sees her proposing enough of a progressive agenda. His main issues are wages, benefits, and taxes, he said on Meet the Press. But let's flesh that out. What is the progressive agenda for America that de Blasio and others are for? Let's hear from one of the leading progressive agenda setters in New York and the nation today, Dan Cantor, co-chair of the Working Families Party, which originated here and is now a national force. Hi, thanks for coming in.
Nice to be here.
So first, might the Working Families Party endorse Hillary Clinton for president?
Sure, it's quite possible. It's quite early in the process. As you know, Working Families is, in this relationship with the Democrats. We try to yank them in what we take to be a common sense progressive direction.
And in your case, it wouldn't be until after the nomination, I guess, right? Because you're not going to, as a separate party, take sides within the Democratic Party, or is that wrong?
Typically we don't, but in rare cases we have. We try to make sure that viable progressives get a chance to be heard. In the presidential election, we never have.
You're not. So you're not among those today asking Elizabeth Warren to please run?
Well, so WFP is now in 9 states. Some of our states have, in fact, called on Warren to run. Others took a different view. We're not, it's a new effort, this national thing that grew out of New York, and so it's finding its way to national decision-making. I think what's shared across all the states is this desire for a serious look at the issues, at what's going on in the country, the electoral moment. That's the moment when the society pauses and says, how are we doing? And we could do a lot better. I think that's our basic view.
Clinton said in her announcement that she was running that the deck is stacked for the benefit of those at the top, which sounds like she's tilting your way. Good start?
Yeah, excellent start. Listen, it's hardly news to say that inequality in its many forms, economic inequality, educational, racial, environmental, is perhaps the core issue of our time. If this election next year is about, it takes place on essentially the Republican playing field, that we have to cut taxes and cut spending and cut regulation, and that's the way forward, then we'll lose. And if it's on our turf of saying, no, we need to raise prosperity generally, then we're in decent shape.
Let me dig into that deck is stacked phrase a little bit, because it suggests that politics are setting up rules that make the playing field in the marketplace unleveled.
Correct.
Right? So that government is skewing income toward the top few percent.
It's not, the great ex-New York Times reporter Johnstone, David Johnston, I think is his name, he writes about taxes, says it's not trickle down, it's Niagara up. It's a very non-virtuous cycle in which economic power leads to more political power, which leads to further economic power, which skews the political game more. So this has been widely commented on, and we're living in a society in which the advantages that accrue to wealth seem to get greater and greater, and it's actually bad for everybody. It's even bad for rich people, and some of them know it, to have such a wildly unequal society. Senator Warren and others have this one statistic. Everybody has their favorite. Apparently from the middle 1930s to 1980, 70% of the income gains went to 90% of the people. Roughly, not quite exact, but pretty close. So the top 10% got 30%. Apparently in the last 35 years, 100% of the gains in income have gone to the top 10%. That is not a democracy. That's an oligarchy, and it's not healthy.
How much do you blame campaign finance? Because I noticed Clinton came right out and said she would support a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United if that's what it takes. And I saw Bernie Sanders is also in the race on TV the other day saying, I want a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United so that all this so-called independent money can't flood into campaigns.
We need that. We need a lot more. The actual model for what we want, we have right here in New York City. We have a low-dollar matching system. Tens of thousands of people contribute, and then the state matches their money. We want people to have skin in the game. So we would say campaign finance reform, public financing of elections essential. We're not going to keep private money out. That's like stopping water from running downhill. The ambition is to get public money in. And if you do that, you'll have better outcomes. Better rules, you get better outcomes.
And so for people who don't know the New York system, it's public financing in the sense that if a candidate for city office raises enough money in small donations, then the city matches it 6 to 1. Is it 6 to 1?
That's right.
So if you what's the limit? What's the largest donation?
$175.
$175.
Not so gigantic.
No, that's a small donation.
But that's worth well over $1,000 to that candidate. So it's worth your while to go have scores of house parties instead of dialing rich people and asking them for $5,000 and $10,000. Get 30 people to a house party. They each give you $25, and that's about worth $5,000.
So if that's the gold standard of campaign finance reform, has Hillary Clinton endorsed it?
I don't know if she's endorsed that specific approach to campaign finance reform, but we're optimistic that she and anybody running, at least on the Democratic side, would do so. There's no way to have the kind of country we want without it.
Mayor de Blasio cited wages, benefits, and taxes.
Right.
What kind of tax policy would meet your litmus test for a progressive agenda?
It's a good question. So, what created the great American middle class was basically two things. Unions pushing up, not just for their own members, but for the broad working class, and high marginal tax rates pushing down, the Great Compression. The head of GM, the famous, the business of America is business, in 1952, he earned what in today's salary would be about $12 million. This is the top business executive in America. That's like a light-hitting second baseman now. It is so out of control, the ratio. It used to be 20 or 40 to 1, and now it's 300 and 400 to 1 from top to bottom. So one thing you have to do is you have to insist that those who are so fortunate pay a bigger share, because it's not to punish them. We need the money to invest in schools and roads and libraries and museums and the things that make, and transit, the things that make civilization. So that's one thing you need to do.
And it's not going to touch their lifestyles at that level of income, is your point, too,
no,
right?
It's preposterous, right? New York City is a good example. There are about 25,000 taxpayers in New York City earning more than $40,000 a week. That's a lot. And there's about 2.5 million earning less than $40,000 a year. So we can do a little bit better than that without, touching the great, mansions in the sky here. I mean, it's somewhat, it's a little bit obscene, some of these real estate pornography that people talk about, the $80 million apartment.
I saw in a Nicholas Kristof column the other day a suggestion that the top tax rate, this means for these really super wealthy earners, be raised to 65%.
It used to be 91% at the end of World War II.
But there were so many tax loopholes that nobody ever paid 91% of it. You wouldn't want to tax somebody at 91%.
Well, you're not paying them on the first dollar. You're paying them, it's a marginal tax rate. It's after they earn a certain amount. Listen, the right's view is that if you tax people too much, they'll stop working. There's no evidence to suggest that, right? Because at some point you're working because work is satisfying. You've already made more money than you or your heirs will ever be able to spend. So it just becomes, an unhealthy fixation. No, we could do a lot better, spend the money wisely, and I'm sure that even the wealthy would prefer a society in which people felt like there was a future. Your prior guests were discussing Baltimore and the absence of a future, right? The expectations. It's like, that's not the country we want.
So how close has Hillary Clinton come to any of that? Tax policy.
I'm not, I have to say I don't actually know. I haven't followed her positions on taxes carefully. My hunch is she's going to migrate in our direction. Whether she goes far enough, that's partly on us to sort of create the public demand for that. Having Sanders in the race is very helpful. The more robust the discussion, the better it is.
And when the mayor says wages and benefits, obviously the minimum wage, we don't need to talk about that. We all know that and what the debate is, and you're aiming for a $15 minimum wage.
Correct.
And we'll see how close Hillary Clinton or any candidate gets to that. Where do benefits come in?
Well, obviously people know about health care, but one thing that we're really concerned about is the destruction of retirement security. This is a gigantic, looming problem, right? People our age are about to retire, and they're not like our parents. We haven't saved as much. You know, the famous three-legged stool of Social Security, the private pension, and your savings. Only one of those legs is really there at this point for very many people, Social Security. So,
so I've heard, and we're going to run out of time soon, so I'm going to move you to this, that one of the progressive agenda items that started to get into the media a little bit is to expand Social Security benefits. Now, as you know, the conversation in this country for the last few decades has been how much are we going to have to cut Social Security benefits because our ratio of young people to old people, you know, is not what it was when FDR created it.
Right. So I'm on the side that thinks we ought to expand. You can do it. You can raise the cap on, you know, as you know, some people stop paying Social Security taxes about the end of the first week. They make so much money, right? The rest of the country pays them all year long.
You only pay it on your first, I think it's
106,000.
118 or something
now?
like that,
no.
thousand of income.
That's
After
right.
that, once you reach that, if you make more than that, people see their paychecks start to go up because the Social Security deduction comes out. That's
right. Very few people earn that kind of money, right? We should be clear that that is the 1% or the 2% perhaps. And I think there's no alternative but to tackle these sorts of concerns if we want to have a broad middle class.
What would the expanded Social Security benefits be?
Presumably, you know, they would push back against these ideas that we should cut the cost of living. Perhaps they would be higher, or they would start, you know, they would rise faster. I'm not an expert on this thing, but for sure we can't have people, you know, this is one of the great accomplishments of America was old people out of poverty. We don't want to reverse that. Any
other issue in our last minute that I haven't mentioned that you want to put near the top of the list?
You know, there's so many. I mean, we have to make it possible for people to create wealth again. We saw a huge destruction of wealth, particularly in the black and brown communities in the subprime crisis. We've got to figure out ways to deal with that. It's not impossible. God gave us brains for a reason. We should use them and not just rely blindly on this idea that the market will produce good outcomes. We will produce good outcomes if we work on it.
Well, thanks a lot for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Up next, how big data feeds big agriculture after this. By the year 2050, the United Nations predicts that the world's population will surpass 9 billion people. It's now about 7 billion. In coming years, high birth rates, longer lifespans, and rapidly rising incomes will pressure farmers to double the amount of food they already produce. So how does agriculture plan on meeting skyrocketing demand? With lots of data, of course. Big agricultural companies like Monsanto and John Deere are leading the charge, spending big money to integrate monitoring and analytics into their product lines, turning farming, of all things, into the latest hot venture. But despite the promise of technology to increase crop yields dramatically, many farmers are not jumping in whole hog. Here to tell us why is ag data expert Douglas Hackney. He's in Texas. Also joining us, Kip Tom, CEO of Tom Farms of Indiana, our man out in the field, experiencing firsthand how tech is transforming day-to-day operations on the farm. Hello to both of you from New York. Thanks very much for joining us.
Hello, Brian.
Good afternoon.
Doug Hackney first. For people in our New York City audience, this idea that agriculture and Silicon Valley may have something in common, may be a new idea. Can you explain it?
Yes, ag has been a bit of a greenfield opportunity for the high-tech people in Silicon Valley, meaning that it's been dominated by a relatively small number of global companies, and the data that is used to drive ag has been somewhat closed off. So it's been very difficult for the traditional model of Silicon Valley, which is a couple of young guys or girls sitting in a coffee shop with laptops to go attack a market, create some innovative solutions, and disrupt that market. But recently, in the last few years, there have been some open initiatives in ag, notably from Purdue University, to open up the data and some of the technology around agriculture. And also there's been a recent push by some of the major brands in ag to support open exchange of data between themselves and between large growers and small growers, large growers such as Kip. So that's opened up opportunities for the traditional model of tech to come in, create some new approaches, some fresh views, some fresh perspectives, and disrupt the existing structure of the marketplace, which has really been in place. The fundamental stack, like we call it in tech, the server stack, the ag stack has basically been the same for thousands of years. So it's a ripe opportunity for tech.
So give me a concrete example of what kind of data, how deep the data is, and then how it gets applied in practice on the farm.
The data is both broad and very deep. For instance, we have a pilot site of about 30,000 acres in the U.S. Last year, we collected about 900 billion data points on that pilot site. We'll be well over 1 trillion data points on that site in this coming year. So what that gives us is the opportunity to capture the life story of every seed. So we know the type of soil the seed is planted in, we know the day it was planted, we know the day it emerges, like its birth, and then we know all the weather that happens to it during its lifetime. We know how the soil was tilled or how it was plowed before it was planted, any cultivation or weed control activities that go on during its growth, any chemicals, fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides that are applied. We even know the eye color of the tractor operator who went over it. So we know exactly how many tractor passes, we know how much fuel was burned during those tractor passes, and then of course we know what the yield is, which in ag means the return on your investment, like your profit. So we capture that as well. We capture that at a very small 1 square meter unit. We track everything at that 1 square meter level, and so that gives us that many. In this case, there were about 150 million square meters. That gave us 150 million opportunities to learn what worked and what didn't. And when my grandfather was farming, and I grew up around that farm, we got one chance a year to figure out what worked and what didn't. We had one big giant experiment in that 80 acres, which is really small by today's standards. So that's, I think, the fundamental difference is now we have 150 million lessons learned per year versus my grandfather who had one.
And so to show our viewers an example of some of this visually, and then we'll talk to Kip Tom about his farm. Let's take a look at a promotional video from the Climate Corporation, which was recently acquired by Monsanto.
Climate Pro can also help you prioritize scouting. With so many acres to cover, knowing where to direct your attention isn't always easy. Even on a single field, spotting a problem can be difficult from the ground. But with a better view and a new perspective, it's easier to see what's hiding in the rows. Using the Scouting Map View to compare the biomass of all the plants in this field, you can see which areas are performing well and which ones are struggling. You can also see the percentage of crop health variability for a simple way to judge how evenly your field is performing. In this case, the center of the field isn't performing as well as the rest. You can mark this as an area of interest with a pin. Then use the pin to navigate to that exact spot in the field so you can investigate, take pictures, and capture notes. With the Vegetative Map View, you see the current level of vegetation across your field so you can track progress throughout the season or compare the progress of different fields. Climate Pro delivers powerful field-level nitrogen tracking, field health monitoring, and more, no matter where you are. Contact your dealer to learn all the ways that Climate Pro can help support your decisions with data science.
So there it is a little bit, the tablet computer and big data out in the fields. Kip Tom, could you tell our viewers a little bit about your farm? Where is it? How big is it? What do you grow?
So I'm Kip Tom. I'm a family farm operation. We've been in the area, or in northern Indiana, I'm the 7th generation. Our family settled here in 1837. Farm today with 3 children, a sister, and a son-in-law, and still have the fortunate opportunity to be around my parents every day. So we're a family operation. We talk acres. We tend to look at our farm in cells. Doug framed it up very well. Instead of having 40 opportunities in our lifetime to produce a crop, I now can break our farm down into over 1 million different cells. If I look at a 30-foot by 30-foot square area, each one has got its own digital signature, its own footprint, or fingerprint, and we can really make changes to impact how we lessen our carbon footprint, how we improve our sustainability and have an impact not only on our productivity, but the environment, and lowering our cost of production to help provide a more reliable, more affordable food source for the consumer. We produce seed corn, and soybeans.
I gather you're working with Monsanto on some of this. What's your relationship with them as a producer of, what's the right word here? Is it raw materials?
Yeah, I guess it'd be raw materials. I mean, you need to understand, farming is manufacturing. I think Doug would hopefully agree with that. You know, we have a finite amount of resources to use, and we need to use them in a structured manner so we protect the environment, we increase productivity, and we make sure that we hand these resources on to the next generation in the best way we can. But on your question, yes, we do work with Climate Corp. One of the tools we're really excited about using this year is their nitrogen management model, where we can actually make sure we apply the right amount of nitrogen in the right place. And oftentimes it's going to lessen the amount of nitrogen we use, protecting the environment, increasing productivity, and using all this big data we've been collecting for many years. So that's one of the tools we're using today. We use a lot of the advanced seeding algorithms where we can actually manage our fields in a more sustainable manner. You know, we've got a corn planter out there today on our farm we're using. It's got over 300 sensors on it, collecting 6 data points per second. So as Doug said, we're collecting a lot of data. Now let's do something with it. And I think we're finding out the ways that we can use this data. Ours is going through Monsanto, but going on into Open Ag Data Alliance based through Purdue University, making sure that we have some control over that data to make sure it goes to the right people. And if at the end of the day we own it, we can control it and take it back. So this is something new for farmers. You know, I think I can remember the story of my grandfather. The skeptics there were when he bought a tractor and the neighbors were still using horses. Everyone says, well, that's just the larger farmers will have it. I'm convinced we'll figure out the marketplace. We'll figure out how to serve all farmers, both big and small, because we need everybody in this business.
So, Doug Hackney, from what I've read, there aren't that many farmers like Kip jumping into big data on the farm with the enthusiasm that he is. Is there a certain group of obstacles that are making people resistant?
I'm not from ag professionally. I spent my career in other market segments. I've just been involved with big data and ag here for the last 3 years or so. So coming back into ag, my observations are that ag is challenged around adoption from the standpoint of characteristically, historically, culturally, it's slow to adopt. It does aggressively adopt technology. If a farmer can buy something and he can see an immediate application, a difference in front of his own eyes. So, for instance, precision ag, one of the biggest wins in precision agriculture was self-guided tractors. Most people out there that are not in ag probably don't know this, but Google cars, self-driving cars have nothing on ag. Tractors have been driving themselves for years, and right now combines, the harvesters that harvest the crops, will take control of a tractor next to it and control that tractor as the combine unloads automatically into it. So not only is the combine driving itself, it's also driving a tractor right next to it. The level of that technology is at the absolute bleeding edge of Internet of Things and that type of technology. However, if a farmer cannot see that physical manifestation of change right there in front of them, my tractor's driving a straight line, it's saving me fuel, then they're much slower to adopt. But let's keep this in mind as well. I spent the last couple of decades trying to drive adoption of data and analytics in regular corporations, and it wasn't really that much faster uptake there either. It's challenging to draw a direct line between point A and here's your outcome of increased return on investment due to data and analytics. Now, we've learned those lessons over the years in other market segments, and I'm confident that growers such as Kip will see those returns and those demonstrated returns on their investments in data in years to come.
I want to put up a chart that I think we got from you, Kip, that shows some of the inputs into your farming output as viewed through the big data lens. So right in the middle there is the cloud. I assume that's not the actual rain cloud that will drop moisture on your crops, but this is the cloud in the internet sense. And there are all these inputs in there. Planes, drones, satellites, scouts. What are some of these things? Where do drones come in, by the way?
Well, in our our operation, today we're using some drones to run some great imagery across our fields to understand what's going on. What's the green biomass? What's it's indicating? Does it mean we have a corn plant or corn area in a field that maybe needs a fungicide, or maybe it needs more nitrogen? We're at the convergence of three innovations right today: biotechnology, the ability to remote monitor, sense and control, and informatics. And so drones are just a component of that, of how we can manage our farms today. We've been at a bit of a disadvantage for years without cell or without clouds. Manufacturing plants have four walls and a ceiling, and they could hardwire their machines and understand what their people are doing. Today, we can do that on the farm with all the connectivity we have available to us today.
Doug, even as much as this looks like it's dense with all these different inputs, data inputs into the cloud, and therefore driving practices on the farm that are supposed to increase yield, I gather you look at this and you say this doesn't even show the half of it, yes?
Yeah, I agree that I would. When I looked at Kip's diagram in the New York Times when that story came out, my comment to my colleague who was sitting next to me is, yeah, this looks exactly like what we've been building in the enterprise for the last few decades. The key value of data is not in the individual sources, and this has been a real challenge in ag specifically, because so far up to now, most of ag, when it comes to data and analytics, is a soda straw view or a siloed view, meaning you get one data stream from each of the manufacturers or the suppliers involved. So you could have a system from Syngenta, a major input supplier. You could have a system from Monsanto or a system from John Deere. But Kip, as a farmer, would have to switch between each one of these in order to get any kind of idea of the big picture of what was going on. The power of data, and this is any data, it doesn't matter if it's healthcare or manufacturing or finance, the power of data is unleashed when it is integrated. So the key in Kip's diagram there is all those lines coming into those one places. So when it comes into that box of Kip Farms or Tom Farms and of the cloud, that's a potential point of integration, and every one of those individual data sources that becomes integrated with another data source becomes exponentially more powerful and potentially informative to both tactical and strategic decisions.
Kip, who owns all this data? This is an issue, right? Whenever we talk big data, we're talking who owns data, we're talking privacy. So like if you have a John Deere tractor and it's generating data, do you own the data about your farm? Does John Deere own the data about your farm? Does it matter?
Well, first of all, I want to add to Doug's comments there. First of all, bringing all this into one central point to help us make decisions is key and central. One of the companies we're involved with is called Granular, trying to develop an ERP system. They're based in San Francisco. And we're very much working with that, trying to advance it and bringing all these different resources in to help us solve some of these issues we need to address on our farm, from profitability to operational perspectives. So to answer your question about when we look at our farm and who owns this data, we own the data. I think you can have a conversation with John Deere, you can have a conversation with Monsanto, Climate Corp, and many of those across the spectrum, and they'll tell you you own the data. Now, it gets down into a different one with some of them. It's a little bit of there's a divergence between the different companies. It comes down to control the data, and I want to make sure that we can control who sees that data, how it's used, where it's stored, how we can retrieve it if we want, and how we can deny access if we want. So it's important to us to share some of this data with other people to help increase productivity, but there's some of it that is our intellectual property. Some of the ways we operate our farm, we want to keep that to ourselves if it's something that gives us a bit of edge in the market. Mm-hmm. But if there's something that can help others that can be broadly known, we want to help with that too. So we own it, we control it.
Doug, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's a very important point in agriculture today. To their credit, the American Farm Bureau Federation got together and created a set of principles about exactly what Kip is talking about who should own the data, how should that data be controlled, how should it be shared. And almost all of the major brands in ag stood up and immediately signed onto those principles. However, this is a big problem because growers like Kip and the millions of other growers in the U.S. all think that by signing those principles that solved the problem and that the growers now own the data. However, there is a tremendous difference between the PR and the marketing that went into signing those principles and the legally binding contracts that growers like Kip sign when they buy a piece of equipment from John Deere, for example, or from any other manufacturer, and also the licensing agreements that they sign with intellectual property owners like the seed companies and or the other input suppliers. So unfortunately, as of right now, almost all of the suppliers that Kip has signed a contract with, if you read the fine print, it states very clearly they own the data, they control it forever, and they can do whatever they want with it. The notable exception here is Monsanto and Climate Corp, and they have, by far, from what I've seen, of the ones I've seen, by far the most clear, open, and farmer-friendly data ownership and control policy of anybody else out there. Up to now, there's still a big chasm between the PR and the advertising that's going on from the ag vendors and what the farmers are signing in legally binding contracts. So this is a big challenge in ag. We're going to have to see how it sorts out. It's really only people, Brian, on your side of the equation at this point, and the other members of the press that are watching this story that can keep up the pressure on these vendors to step up and follow through. Don't just make the commitment with the signing of the principles. They need to follow through and alter their contracts to reflect what their advertising and their websites are telling their customers.
Thanks for the story tip. Doug, last question for you. We started the segment talking about the continuing growth of population on Earth, 7 billion roughly now, going to 9 billion by 2050, and that food production might have to practically double because also people are consuming more as there are more middle-class people in the world, et cetera. How close to that goal does this data, do these analytics bring us by themselves, just by having more information about the technology that's currently available to grow food, as opposed to if some new technology for actually growing food were to come down the pike? What percentage increase can this, if widely applied, actually produce?
I don't, based on what I've observed since I've gotten back involved with ag here in the last 3 years or so, I don't see a rate of progress with the existing technologies in ag that will ever get us close enough. There's two factors to that. One is I've spent a lot of time in the developing world, and these people are not going to wait until New Year's Eve 2049 to start burning things because they don't have any food to eat. They're going to start burning things in 2025 to 2030. So we've only got 15 more years, which means if you do Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere, that's 30 harvests, to prove that we're going to double calorie production, food production in the world so that everybody can eat. Now, I'm not seeing a rate of progress with the existing technologies, whether it's genetics or natural selection or any other innovation, tillage practice, anything that is showing a rate of progress anywhere close to what's going to be needed to demonstrate success by that point in time. Yes, I'm a data guy, I admit it. I'm a proponent of data. So you have to take this, with a grain of salt of where it's coming from. But I contend, my assertion is that data, big data, is going to be the main driver to power the step change that we need in ag in order to feed the world. This happened once with the Green Revolution in the 60s. It can happen again now. The key is to look at those hundreds of millions of test plots that we have running. Each one is unique. If you look at what works and what doesn't at that level, suddenly you don't have, as Kip said, a normal farmer only has 40 times at bat, only 40 trips to the free throw line, 40 shots on goal in their lifetime to prove that they know what they're doing. That's how many crops they bring in. But with the way that we can scale out big data across all of this, and especially with if you go along with Kip and say, hey, let's share some of this data so that we can pool it together and learn some things, that gives us all a fighting chance to double food production and being able to feed the world by the time we are actually going to be able to do it.
Well,
2025.
Very, very interesting stuff. A lot of new stuff to our viewers here in New York City, and I thank you very much for sharing it with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
For Public Intellectual, where we look at new research with the power to change our minds and public policy. Today, work hours and happiness. If you like your work, does doing more of it bring you more happiness? The answer might depend on gender, marital status, and whether you live in the USA. A new study finds that married men in the United States are more likely to derive happiness from longer workdays than their counterparts in Latin America. Here to discuss these and other results via Skype from Dallas is Rubia Valente, Research Associate in the School of Economics, Political and Policy Sciences at the University of Texas at Dallas. Her study, Working Hours and Life Satisfaction, a Cross-Cultural Comparison of Latin America and the United States. It was published in the April issue of the Journal of Happiness Studies. Thanks very much for joining us, Professor Valente. Hello from New York.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I didn't know there was such a thing as the Journal of Happiness Studies.
Yes, there is. And for some reason, every time I talk to people about my research, they start laughing just because they think it's funny, I guess, to be researching happiness.
Or at least that there's a journal dedicated to the academic study of it. So what question were you trying to answer, essentially, in this study?
So we were trying to see whether there was a relationship between working hours and happiness in the United States and Latin America. We did find that although they share many common determinants of happiness, hours work was not among them. Latin Americans are happier working fewer hours, whereas U.S. Americans are happier working longer hours. And trying to figure out why this was the case, we believe that it is differences in cultural values, especially the distinction between collectivism, which we observe in Latin American societies, and individualism, which is predominant in the United States. And as you mentioned, these relationships only apply to married men. It does not hold for females and those that were not married.
So how would you account for the fact that it applies more to married men? Are they trying to get away from their wives so they're happier if they're at work longer? Does status, or do they just need the money more if they're married, and married people tend to have children? So the money does buy happiness, or what do you think?
It seems to us, though, that married men, they're really trying to fulfill what they believe society is expecting of them as married men. Happiness comes from achieving what society deems to be important, and in the United States, working is deemed to be very important, particularly if you're married and you now have more responsibilities. So there is also this belief that working harder and longer hours will equate to success. So they might be trying to fulfill what they believe is expected of them, while at the same time, individualistic values in the United States reinforce this idea that they should be working harder and more in order to be successful.
And that wouldn't be true of married men in Mexico? Why? Or in Latin America?
So in Latin American societies, these societies are much more collectivist societies. So there's a greater emphasis on the family. The families are much more of a safety net. So there's not only a great emphasis on the family, but also in time spent with the family and with friends. So working more actually takes time away from leisure times that you would otherwise spend with family. So that's why we see these differences. At least that's why what we think that it's causing these differences.
But you didn't find any differences cross-culturally among women or among unmarried men?
So among women and people that are single, both married, both men and women that are single.
No difference. And do you think you just didn't find it, but it's there somewhere? Because I would think this cross-cultural difference of individualism in the United States versus more collectivism in Latin America would apply to the happiness of single people too.
We have to research that further, and that's something that we talk about in the paper. So we found these results, and we say, why is this the case? So we question why we didn't see these results apply for women in particular and for single people, but that's really something for us to research further and try to figure out what's going on there.
How do you define happiness? Is there a standard definition of happiness in academia that's used as a constant in the Journal of Happiness Studies or anywhere else?
Normally, the question asking for happiness, and even the ones we use in this study, They ask things like taken all together, how satisfied are you with your life? Are you very satisfied? Are you somewhat dissatisfied or very dissatisfied with your life? There are other surveys like the General Social Survey that ask, taken all together, how would you say things are these days? Would you say that you're very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy? So many times life satisfaction, quality of life, and happiness are all used interchangeably among researchers, although they do mean different things. Happiness is more a state of well-being, a positive feeling, whereas life satisfaction is being content with the life you have. So although they do mean different things, they are very highly correlated. So researchers use them interchangeably, and that's what we also did in our study.
I gather that you personally are from Sao Paulo, Brazil, which has a reputation of people working very hard, but then you moved to the States and you saw that, yeah, people work really hard too, but somehow it's different. So what's your personal observation?
It's different. Well, I think that what's different for me was really the emphasis on the family. Even though you might work harder in Sao Paulo, you also put a lot of time towards the family and towards your friend, and you spend a lot of time with them. So yes, you work, but during the weekends, you're always with your friends, you're always with your family, there are always gatherings. So normally when I see friends here talking about, oh, it's Thanksgiving, we got to get together with the whole family. Well, that's every week in Sao Paulo, right? So there is this greater emphasis in being together with the family. Another difference that I saw when I moved here is the fact that people move out of their homes when they turn 18 and they go to college. And that's something that doesn't happen in Latin America, especially in Brazil. You're supposed to live with your parents until you get married. And most of the times, once you get married, you're still living close to your family. I have cousins and friends who are single, they're in their mid-30s, and they live still with their parents, and that's something that's perfectly normal. They do work, they have their lives, but it's very much embedded in the family as well.
So that's either warm and fuzzy or it's incredibly suffocating.
It could be.
I guess the U.S. sees it one way and more people in Latin America see it the other way.
Exactly, because it's really all about the culture, right? And what the culture is emphasizing and what the culture deems to be important. So in cultures where the family is deemed to be very important, people are going to take pleasure and happiness from being together with their family. Whereas in another society where it's really more individualistic values and you're forced to go out and move out and have your own life and have your own job and look after yourself, working more would equate for you to becoming a successful person. So you really
makes sense.
You don't have to fall back on. Yeah.
Well, I think you've increased people's happiness at least a little bit by presenting this information. Thank you very much.
Hope so. Thank you for having me.
And that's our program for this week. We're here with a new show every week at this hour, and do tune in to my radio program weekday mornings at 10 a.m. on WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow, Peter Schweitzer, author of the controversial new book, Clinton Cash. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.